They feared no blade, no battlefield, and not even death itself. But they trembled at the thought of a courtroom. In medieval Europe, justice was not served, was inflicted. A single accusation could mean a trial by fire, a cage above the river, or an iron boot that shattered bones. For thieves, the punishment wasn't just painful, it was personal. This isn't just history, it's what fear really looked like. In the early medieval period, justice wasn't written in volumes of legal codes, it was enforced by custom, power, and spectacle. Across Europe, there was no central legal system, no presumption of innocence, and no uniform method of trial. Law was fragmented and heavily influenced by local lords, tribal traditions, and the church. What one village saw as a minor offense, another might treat with death. But across regions, one thing remained consistent. Punishment was swift, brutal, and deeply personal. Feudal society was structured around loyalty and hierarchy. Crimes like theft weren't merely offenses against property, they were betrayals of trust, direct insults to authority, and threats to social stability. In a world where survival often hinged on cooperation, a stolen loaf of bread or a missing tool could trigger starvation, failure of a harvest, or even violence. Justice, therefore, was not just punitive, it was a message. For peasants, justice often meant subjection to the will of the local lord. If someone was accused of a crime, their fate depended less on evidence and more on power dynamics. Trials could involve no more than a verbal accusation followed by immediate punishment. Those accused had little means of defense. The lord acted as judge, jury, and executioner. In many manorial courts, decisions were made, publicly often held, in open fields or village greens to ensure humiliation played its part. In Germanic regions, the concept of wergild, or man price, dominated justice for centuries. It placed a monetary value on every crime and every person. Theft could be repaid in silver, the thief was caught and could pay. But when the victim was poor, or the accused was already a repeat offender, restitution was rarely an option. Physical punishment followed: flogging, mutilation, branding, or banishment. The church also held immense sway. Canon law operated alongside secular systems, and the clergy often stepped in to handle moral offenses. Yet even their judgments were far from lenient. A thief might be forced to perform humiliating penance, parade through the streets barefoot, or face excommunication. And while church law technically forbade bloodshed, it often handed the accused back to secular powers to carry out corporal punishments. Public punishment served a crucial purpose. It reminded everyone that crime didn't just target individuals, it disrupted the divine and social order. Stocks in the town square, hanging cages on the gates, and pillories in front of churches all acted as deterrents. The sight of a thief writhing in pain was not just expected, it was necessary. This wasn't justice built on rehabilitation or fairness, it was built on fear. And for thieves, in particular those who challenged trust, property, and survival, there was no room for mercy. Not in the law, not in the eyes of their neighbors, and certainly not in the hands of those who held power in medieval society. Theft wasn't just a legal offense, it was a rupture in the moral and social fabric. Unlike murder, which often sparked blood feuds or was settled through compensation, or treason, which was viewed as a threat to political power, theft struck at something more personal: trust. Most medieval communities were small, tightly knit, and heavily dependent on mutual cooperation. A missing sack of grain or a stolen tool wasn't just an inconvenience, it could sabotage an entire harvest or leave a family without food for the winter. Resources were limited, labor was communal, and ownership, while unevenly distributed, was essential for survival. In this context, stealing was treated not only as a selfish act, it was a direct assault on the entire village's chance to endure. Feudal lords viewed theft as a challenge to their authority. In a world where land equaled power, property was sacred. A thief wasn't just taking goods, they were undermining the structure that kept everyone in place. In many regions, theft of even minor items could result in harsh penalties, flogging, branding, or exile. Repeat offenders faced mutilation or execution. The law didn't scale punishment based on value, it scaled it based on disobedience. Unlike acts of violence, which could sometimes be justified as self-defense or resolved through compensation, theft left no room for negotiation. The act was premeditated, hidden, and silent. It wasn't committed in the heat of anger, it was calculated. That made it harder to forgive and easier to condemn. The Church's position reinforced this view. According to canon law, theft was not only a sin against another person, but also an offense against God's order. The seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," was taken literally. Thieves were urged to confess and repent, but even penance often came with social consequences. Public penance, enforced fasting, exclusion from the sacraments. These punishments isolated the thief, spiritually and socially. What made theft uniquely dangerous was its invisibility. A community could see a brawl, they could witness a murder, but a thief worked in the dark, breaking bonds without confrontation. That uncertainty bred paranoia. Suspicion fractured villages. People guarded their belongings, watched their neighbors, distrusted their kin. Fear of theft didn't just come from the act, it came from the question it left behind. Who among us did this? In many parts of Europe, thieves were seen as contagious. Let one go unpunished, and others might follow. Allow leniency, and the order would decay. This belief led to harsh crackdowns, even for children or desperate peasants. There was little distinction between survival-driven theft and criminal intent. In the eyes of the law, theft was theft. By punishing it with such intensity, authorities made an example out of every transgressor. The gallows wasn't just about ending a life, it was a warning. In a world built on trust, a thief didn't just steal possessions, they stole security, and that made them more dangerous than most murderers. In medieval Europe, a courtroom didn't always have benches, juries, or written law. For many, a trial meant pain, and truth wasn't found through argument or evidence, it was revealed through suffering. This was justice by ordeal, a system that asked not what could be proven, but who could endure. The most common form was the ordeal by hot iron. The accused, often a suspected thief, was forced to carry a red-hot bar of metal across a fixed distance, usually 3 paces. Their hand was then bound and sealed for 3 days. Afterward, a priest would examine the wound. If it had begun to heal cleanly, the accused was considered innocent. If infection or blistering remained, they were guilty. The logic was simple. God would not let the innocent suffer unjustly, but in practice, the outcome depended on weather, bandaging, and the discretion of the cleric overseeing the wound. In regions like Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish kingdoms, boiling water was another method. The accused plunged their hand into a cauldron to retrieve a stone from the bottom. As with the hot iron, the healing of the burn was interpreted as a sign from God. The more severe version, known as the 3-stone ordeal, required the hand to remain submerged until all three were pulled out. Survival, let alone acquittal, was rare. Ordeal by cold water worked on a different principle. Here, the accused was tied and lowered into a body of water, usually a river or well. If they sank, they were pulled out and declared innocent. If they floated, they were guilty. Water, being considered pure, would reject the sinful. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council officially forbade clergy from participating in these ordeals. But by then, thousands had already been subjected to them. In some areas, especially in rural Eastern Europe, the practice persisted for centuries. One recorded case comes from 1140 in Würzburg, Germany, where a man accused of theft underwent the ordeal of hot iron. Despite suffering deep burns, the priest claimed the wound showed no divine healing. The man lost his hand. In another case from 1196, near Canterbury, a woman was accused of stealing bread during a famine. She underwent the boiling water ordeal. She died of infection days later. No restitution was offered to her family. These rituals weren't designed to find truth, they were built to frighten. Even if one survived, the scars remained. Hands permanently damaged, faces marked, names ruined. In a culture where public honor shaped your future, surviving an ordeal didn't always restore one's place in society. Justice didn't require consistency. It required a spectacle. Communities gathered to watch these ordeals, not because they believed in their fairness, but because they believed in deterrence. The pain wasn't a flaw in the process. It was the point. For the accused thief, the trial was never about proving innocence. It was a gauntlet of survival, one in which mercy rarely intervened, and the pain itself became the verdict. In medieval Europe, confession was the most powerful evidence, but it didn't have to be voluntary. Under many local and royal legal systems, especially from the 13th century onward, the confession of the accused became the goal of criminal proceedings. If it couldn't be secured by questioning, then it was extracted through pain. Torture wasn't hidden in shadowy dungeons. It was sanctioned by kings, courts, and even the church. The logic was blunt. If the body breaks, the truth emerges. The rack was among the most feared instruments, used throughout England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It was designed to dislocate the limbs by stretching them with ropes. And rollers, it wasn't used to kill. It was used to terrorize. Victims often confessed long before the machine reached full tension. In many cases, the mere sight of the device or hearing another prisoner's screams was enough. In Italy and Spain, the strappado was more common. The accused was hoisted by the wrists behind their back, then dropped suddenly. The shoulders often dislocated on the first fall. Some jurisdictions allowed multiple drops each time, increasing the risk of permanent damage. The aim wasn't precision, it was fear. The thumbscrew appeared frequently in Germany and the Low Countries. It crushed the fingers, sometimes slowly, sometimes with sudden force. The device could be adjusted to prolong the agony for hours. Inquisitors liked it because it was compact, quiet, and didn't require special preparation. It could be applied during interrogation without disrupting the flow of questioning. Hot irons, burning tongs, and spiked collars were used across Central and Eastern Europe. In Poland and Hungary, the Spanish boot, a metal or wooden vise tightened around the leg, was often used on suspected thieves. When tightened, it splintered the shin bones. Once a confession was signed or witnessed under torture, it was rarely questioned. Legal codes, such as the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina issued under Charles V, in 1532, formalized the process. A confession had to be confirmed without torture, but in practice, that meant little. The accused, broken by pain, would almost always repeat what was needed. The Church, while uneasy with bloodshed, sanctioned torture during the Inquisition. Heresy, like theft, was considered a threat to the moral order. By the 1250s, papal law allowed torture under strict conditions, but those conditions were often ignored. Inquisition records from Languedoc and Aragon reveal widespread use of torture to force names, locations, and recantations. Public awareness of torture wasn't limited to the courtrooms. Word spread quickly. Townsfolk whispered about the cries, echoing from stone towers. Travelers described devices they'd seen with their own eyes. Fear moved faster than written law. For the accused, the question wasn't just, did I do it? It became, how long can I hold out? The answer was, rarely long. Even innocent people broke under pressure. And once a confession was extracted, retraction was nearly impossible. Torture didn't just enforce the law, it created it. And for suspected thieves, it blurred the line between guilt and survival. In a system where the body spoke louder than the mind, truth became whatever the pain demanded. In many parts of medieval Europe, execution was seen not as the harshest punishment, but as the cleanest. For thieves, especially repeat offenders, death could be a release compared to what awaited those who lived. Authorities didn't always want corpses. They wanted warnings. Mutilation was among the most common alternatives to hanging. Hands were prime targets, specifically the right hand, the symbolic instrument of theft. In 13th century England, a man convicted of stealing sheep might have one hand amputated on the spot. The sentence could be carried out in the village square, in full view of neighbors and kin. It wasn't just about punishing the thief, it was about sending a message. Branding served a similar function. In France, the lettre de galari could result in a hot iron pressed into the skin, usually the shoulder or cheek, burning the letter V for velorthi. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, branded faces identified criminals for life. It was irreversible. It followed the accused everywhere, in marketplaces, in churches, at marriage negotiations. No one could hide it. Even those acquitted on appeal were often left with the mark. In Scandinavian kingdoms and some parts of Eastern Europe, punishments extended to the mouth. Repeat liars, thieves, or slanderers could have their tongues partially cut or entirely removed. The act was brutal, often done with a dull blade or red-hot tongs. Survivors faced more than pain. They lost the ability to work, to speak clearly, to bargain, to beg. It wasn't just bodily harm, it was social erasure. Public flogging was another, staple across feudal jurisdictions. It wasn't a single whipping, it was a spectacle. In Florence, for instance, convicted thieves were paraded half-naked through the streets, lashed repeatedly at key intersections. Crowds gathered. Some cheered, others jeered. The more notorious the theft, the more brutal the route. Then came exile. In the city-states of Italy and the trading hubs of the Hanseatic League, banishment was a preferred sentence for thieves who had influential allies or family protections. But exile was not survival. A person cast out from their home had no land, no network, and no legal protection. Many became vagrants. Others died from exposure or starvation. Some turned to crime, again not by choice, but because no one would hire a branded or maimed man. The long-term effects of being marked extended beyond the individual. Families bore the stigma. Inheritance claims were challenged. Marriages were denied. Children, even those born years later, could be punished socially for the crimes of their parents. Honor was a currency, and once lost, it was rarely regained. Legal records from Lubeck, Paris, and York all show that branded thieves were sometimes denied entry into guilds, barred from buying land, and excluded from community oaths. In feudal law, rehabilitation barely existed. Punishment wasn't just physical, it was permanent. In this system, death meant closure, but mutilation meant living proof. A face disfigured by iron, a voice lost to blade, a hand missing at the wrist. These were the true emblems of medieval justice. They outlived the crime. They outlived the sentence. And sometimes they outlived the person. In medieval Europe, punishment wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about breaking the spirit. Public shaming wasn't just a tool. For discipline, it was a performance designed to humiliate the condemned and warn everyone else. The pillory stood at the heart of many towns often near the market square or church steps. Offenders, especially petty thieves and swindlers, were locked into a wooden frame by the neck and wrists, exposed for hours or days. But the real punishment came from the crowd. Rotten food, animal waste, sharp stones, nothing was off limits. Children threw, adults spat, and everyone stared. There was no escape. Records from 14th century London mention a man named Walter Palmer, convicted of stealing cloth, who endured a full day in the pillory. He survived the sentence, but his business collapsed soon after. His reputation never recovered. Stocks functioned similarly. They restrained the legs, sometimes the arms, and were placed in open-air locations. In smaller villages, these punishments were less about pain and more about recognition. Everyone knew who you were, and after a public sentence, everyone remembered. More grotesque were the iron masks and shame devices used in parts of Germany, Austria, and Scotland. These were custom-made metal face coverings, molded into the shapes of animals, devils, or fools. One type, called the brank or scold's bridle, included a spiked bit that cut into the tongue if the wearer spoke, though often used against women accused of gossip or slander. It was also applied to thieves who lied during confession. The punishment wasn't silence, it was spectacle. Shaming parades took the punishment beyond the square. Convicted individuals were sometimes forced to walk through town carrying signs that declared their crimes. In Cologne, during the 15th century, thieves were made to wear painted tunics with images of the stolen items. In Siena, a baker who shorted weights was marched through the streets with false loaves tied around his neck. These acts weren't spontaneous. They were carefully orchestrated by officials to control public behavior through mockery. The social consequences lasted longer than the sentence. A man seen in the pillory might be avoided at church. A woman made to wear a shame mask might be denied employment or marriage. These punishments touched not just the guilty, but their families. Children were taunted. Siblings distanced themselves. Shame bled into every part of daily life. What made these methods effective wasn't just the cruelty, it was the memory. The lash scarred the body, but shame scarred the name. In communities where trust was everything, humiliation could destroy a person standing faster than any blade. And once lost, that standing was rarely restored. Public humiliation turned crime into theater. It didn't just punish, it branded. And it taught everyone watching that no sin would go unnoticed and no ridicule withheld. Justice in medieval Europe wasn't always handed down by a lord, bishop, or appointed official. In villages far from courts or castles, Justice could be immediate and unforgiving. When tempers flared and trust snapped, the crowd often became the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Mob justice thrived in the gaps where law was slow or unreachable. In small rural communities, especially across 12th to 15th century England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, a stolen chicken or a missing coin purse could trigger violent retribution. Villagers didn't wait for sheriffs or clerks. They acted. Theft stirred more than outrage. It sparked fear. Livelihoods were fragile. Property meant survival. And when suspicion landed on a traveler, a local outcast, or even a neighbor, the response was often swift. Crowds formed fast. Stones were the most common weapon readily available, easily thrown and hard to trace. In southern France during the early 14th century, records show multiple cases where suspected thieves were stoned to death in village squares. The crowd too large to blame any one person. Hangings without trial weren't rare either. Trees at crossroads or gallows hills on the edge of town became unofficial execution sites. In 1381, during the chaos of the English Peasants' Revolt, dozens of suspected looters and thieves were captured and strung up by local militias and townspeople. No hearing, no defense. The same occurred in 1434 near Cologne, where a traveling merchant accused of theft was seized by townsfolk and hanged within hours. Officials later declared the act illegal. The town called it necessary. Drownings, though less common, were used when water was nearby. In parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, communal punishment often involved binding the accused and casting them into a river. One Danish court record from 1476 describes villagers who drowned a man they accused of stealing church silver. By the time the bailiff arrived, the body was already gone downstream. These acts weren't always about guilt. Often they were about fear. In times of famine, war, or plague, anxiety ran high. Rumors spread quickly. Foreigners, vagabonds, and even children became scapegoats. If someone was caught in the act or simply accused, the crowd didn't pause to ask questions. Authorities didn't always intervene. In some cases, local officials quietly endorsed such actions. It spared them the cost and process of formal trials. In others, they punished the mob when the violence grew too visible or politically risky. Mob justice didn't follow rules. It followed pressure, the pressure to act fast, the pressure to be seen doing something, and the pressure to make an example. For thieves, that meant that even if they escaped the law, they couldn't escape the people. In towns where justice was slow, vengeance moved fast. And once the crowd made up its mind, mercy had no place to stand. Execution in the medieval world was more than a sentence. It was a stage. From the 12th to the 16th century, rulers across Europe turned death into a public display planned, timed, and meant to be seen. Hangings were the most common form of execution, especially for theft. Gallows were often erected just outside town walls or at crossroads places where traffic was guaranteed. In England, the Tyburn gallows outside London became infamous. By the 15th century, it drew crowds in the thousands. Vendors sold food. Musicians played. Children climbed trees for a better view. Executions were scheduled at midday, when people could gather. For authorities, visibility mattered more than efficiency. The condemned were paraded through the streets, sometimes on carts, sometimes forced to walk. In Paris, during the reign of Philip IV, Thieves were led across key market routes before being hanged on the gibbet de Montfaucon, multi-tiered scaffold that could display dozens of bodies at once. The spectacle didn't end with the drop. Bodies were often left hanging for days as a warning. Ravens circled. The smell spread. No one forgot. Beheadings were reserved for nobles or high-profile criminals. The blade offered a cleaner death, but the ritual was no less theatrical. In 1305, William Wallace, accused of treason by Edward I, was executed in London. After being dragged through the streets, he was hanged, disemboweled, and finally beheaded. His head was placed on a spike atop London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. It wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. Burnings were rare but unforgettable. Heretics, coin forgers, and those who committed sacrilegious thefts could face fire. In 1431, Joan of Arc was burned. In Rouen, hundreds watched. Witnesses described the crowd's silence, the priests chanting, and the moment her heart remained untouched by Flemen event later, recorded by English chroniclers and later weaponized by her supporters as proof of divine favor. Crowd behavior varied. Some cheered, others heckled. In parts of Flanders and southern Germany, mobs occasionally pelted the condemned with stones or mud as they ascended the scaffold. In 15th century Florence, a known thief named Tommaso di Giusto was so hated by locals that the executioner had to be guarded from the crowd, fearing they'd rush the gallows before the sentence could be completed. For rulers, these executions weren't just legal acts, they were tools of control. A public death sent a clear message. Power belonged to those who enforced it. Monarchs, city councils, and religious courts all understood that a gallows could do what a law book couldn't: instill obedience through fear. And it worked. People remembered the names. They remembered the screams. They remembered the smell of rope and fire. Justice wasn't just delivered, it was performed, and the performance was meant to last long after the condemned had drawn their final breath. Escape from medieval justice was nearly impossible. The reach of authority may have varied across regions, but once a sentence was passed or suspicion confirmed, the grip tightened fast and rarely let go. Fugitives who fled the scene of a crime, particularly theft, were branded as outlaws in many legal systems. Under English common law, to be declared outlawed meant more than being wanted, meant being legally dead. Anyone could kill you on sight without consequence. No court would hear your case. No priest would bury your body. The crown, no longer recognized you as part of the realm. In 13th century England, fugitives had 40 days of sanctuary if they reached a church. But after that, if they didn't surrender, they were stripped of all protection. Bribery was another path attempted by the desperate. In many towns, especially across Italy and the German principalities, lower officials, like bailiffs and scribes, could be persuaded if the accused had wealth. But this came with risk. If the bribe was exposed, the punishment often doubled. Records from Lübeck in 1876 mention a merchant's son who offered silver to a city guard in exchange for leniency. After a theft, he was caught and flogged twice, once for the theft, again for attempting to corrupt justice. Pardons were possible, though rare. Monarchs and lords could issue them at will, but they were often reserved for political reasons. In France, during the 100 Years' War, King Charles VII issued conditional pardons to prisoners in exchange for military service. Known as letters de remission, these documents forgave crimes if the offender agreed to fight. For some, it meant a second chance. For most, it meant dying in battle instead of on the scaffold. In England, the practice of benefit of clergy allowed literate men, usually those who could recite Psalm 51, to be tried in ecclesiastical courts rather than secular ones. Church courts were far more lenient. However, by the 15th century, this loophole was increasingly restricted. Secular judges began branding the thumbs of those who claimed the privilege, marking them as used so they couldn't claim it twice. Exile was offered in certain city-states as an alternative to mutilation or execution. Florence, Venice, and Genoa had formal systems for banishment. A convicted thief might be ordered to leave the city and its territory for a set number of years, often under threat of death if they returned. But exile wasn't safety, it was exposure. The banished had no legal protections. Many starved, were robbed, or were killed by vigilantes or rival towns. Those who did flee were often tracked down. Local communities were incentivized to turn in fugitives. In England, sheriffs organized hue and cry, legal obligation for villagers to pursue a criminal. Failure to join the chase could result in punishment for the entire community. It created a system where everyone became part of law enforcement, willingly or not. Mercy existed, but not for the poor, the unknown, or the repeat offender. Those without influence had little chance. The law wasn't blind. It saw titles, it saw coin, and it rarely saw forgiveness. The legacy of medieval justice didn't end with the Middle Ages. Its echoes carried forward, etched into legal systems, preserved in common law, and embedded in cultural memory. The brutality, the ritual, the spectacle, none of it disappeared overnight. It evolved, rebranded under the language of reform. But the fear it produced remained. By the 17th century, European states began centralizing power. Kings replaced lords. Written codes replaced local custom, and trials began to resemble formal proceedings. But the instinct behind punishment, the need to display authority through suffering, persisted. In England, public executions continued into the 1800s. Thieves were still hanged for stealing a handkerchief. The Bloody Code, enacted in the 18th century, listed over 200 capital crimes, many for minor thefts. The rope remained, even as judges wore powdered wigs in France. The guillotine became the new symbol of state justice after 1792. Sold as a humane device, it was anything but anonymous. Executions remained public. Crowds gathered, names were shouted, and heads were raised. The method changed. The message did not dot. The physical tools of torture disappeared from official courtrooms, but psychological remnants stayed behind. The presumption of guilt in poor defendants. The fear of arbitrary power. The disproportionate response to petty crimes. These were not modern inventions, they were inherited habits. Even today, remnants of this legacy survive. In some parts of the world, public shaming is still used as punishment. Forced apologies broadcast online. Names listed in newspapers. Mugshots circulated before trial. Modern justice systems claim neutrality, but bias, spectacle, and disproportion often echo the old world more than they admit. The transformation from medieval ordeal to due process was not driven by enlightenment alone. It was driven by centuries of fear. Fear of authority. Fear of the mob. Fear of punishment that didn't match the crime. Law reformers in the 18th and 19th centuries cited the horrors of medieval justice as their justification for change. Jeremy Bentham, Cesare, Beccaria, and others didn't imagine cruelty. They reacted to centuries of it, and still. For those who study history, one fact stands out. For the medieval thief, death was rarely the scariest outcome. A swift hanging ended the story. But justice, the kind that stretched limbs, burned flesh, scarred faces, and destroyed names, was the part they feared most. That fear didn't vanish. It adapted. It modernized. It slipped into systems that promised order but often delivered control. The spectacle dimmed, but the memory remained. Not because history forgot it, but because law never fully left it behind.